All right.
Hey everyone, good evening. Welcome to SPSM Chat 2.0 Reboot. My name is Anne Marie Matulis. I chair the American Association of Suicidology's Impacted Family and Friends Committee. I am the founder and CEO of A Voice at the Table, which is a movement for impacted family and friends because we were tired of being marginalized. Did I say that out loud? I did. Do I care? No. We need to say things out loud. We need to be loud and we need to be clear. And we need to step up and not be afraid to touch on subjects that are not necessarily comfy and warm and fuzzy. And that's what we're about tonight. So I just want a couple of housekeeping things out there. As you're tweeting and saying hello, please let us know who you are, where you're from. I think the question this evening was, what was the most current book you were reading, which was a joke for me because I'm a multi-reader. So I typically have 5 to 6 books going at the same time. And it's even easier for me now because I found Audible. I have rheumatoid arthritis, so it's hard for me to hold books anymore. And when I found out I could put the books in my ear and I could just listen to it and I could just move and do anything I wanted, I mean, it was like I like died and gone to heaven. It was just awesome. And I thought, why did I wait so long to find Audible? So that was our question for today. If as you're tweeting and quoting tweets and saying hi to people, can you please remember the hashtag SPSM? And we'll come back. There'll be some questions rolling out that were prepared for you by our guests. So it would really be cool if you guys could, take a look and respond to them. Ask a lot of questions. We're going to put it up on the feed. And I'm coming off camera and I'm going to turn this over to the very capable hands of Jess Stolman-Rainey. Jess, it's all yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am Jess Stolman-Rainey, and I work at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners in Denver, Colorado, and do a lot of work around social justice and suicide and mental health. And I am here with a couple of activists that I wanted to bring on and introduce because we have a interesting topic to talk about that is a really complex one that we don't address in suicidology very often. So I'm really excited to have them here. We're going to be talking about the politics of knowledge production as it relates to suicide. So I'll turn it over to Emily to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Cutler. I am a Mad Pride activist and disability justice activist. So I've been involved in disability rights work for the past several years, kind of advocating for the value of experiences that we consider madness instead of a pathology framework. And I've also been in a PhD program and kind of been interested in critiques of empiricism and the ways that we produce knowledge.
All right, TK.
Hey, I am. My name is Trauma Queen, and I am an activist. I'm a mad person. I also have a gnarly sinus infection right now, so apologies for the sound of my voice. Addressing another elephant in the room, you will notice that I am masked up. Much of my activism takes place in digital spaces. As a mad person and an activist, I and many of my comrades have encountered very real threats to our safety and security as part of this work. This can and does impact our lives both in online spaces and in our physical world. It is for these reasons that I choose to take extra precautions and to protect myself by avoiding having my face online. So solidarity to all my mad comrades and mad people that are tuning in right now, and let's get this thing started. Jess.
All right. So I'm just going to start with kind of an overview of like what we're even talking about when we're talking about knowledge production. Really thinking about the way we come to know things. So I think that oftentimes this gets sort of set up as knowledge production being something that just happens inside academic spaces, but really knowledge is something that's produced in all kinds of different ways in our lives. So typically we kind of associate it with like positivist academic activity. It can also, but knowledge can be produced communally, relationally, socially, culturally through our experiences. And the perspective that I tend to align with on knowledge production is really about the relationship between power and knowledge. Those two things are not independent entities, but they're completely inextricably intertwined. So knowledge is always an exercise in power, and power is always a function of knowledge. And power in and of itself isn't a bad thing necessarily. It's what we do with that kind of matters. So a lot of this perspective is shaped by an author called Foucault, and he talked really, one of his most famous examples of this connection between knowledge and power is from a book called The History of Sexuality that's about the Catholic Church. It's about how the church formed our ideas of sexuality. So he argued that in the Christian church, there was a huge influence on modern psychology, and this really took place through confession, which is a form of power. People had to tell the truth and produce knowledge about their sexual desires, emotions, disposition. And because of those confessions, their sexual identities came to be a core part of their existence, which is another form of knowledge. And then once you have an identity like that, then it becomes something that can be monitored by society and cultivated, which is another form of control. And you see this kind of thing replicated within sort of modern psychology, is that like people have to go to a doctor and confess the things that are going on, and you have to tell the truth to get better. And there's one truth, capital T. And so that's kind of where we're coming from to this discussion about power and knowledge and the politics involved in that. I think with suicide specifically, there are a couple of kinds of power that are really important related to knowledge. And that's when whatever it is that you know can be questioned enough that we can exert power over you through systems to take your rights away. So that's kind of like the big focal point to me, although there's lots of nuance to that the other presenters will talk about some as well. So that's sort of a basic overview of what we mean when we're talking about knowledge production. I'm going to let Emily give us some information about empiricism and how we've sort of privileged that culturally.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you for that kind of amazing overview of knowledge production. And yeah, I've sort of never thought about it that way before. So thank you. But yeah, I think empiricism and the ways that we privilege empiricism really goes along with that. So basically in our culture, in academia, in science, we have this idea that we can't know something unless it can be measured, or that the real legitimate source of knowledge is that which can be measured. And in some ways, that's sort of the antithesis of a person's experience. It's kind of saying that a person's experience in of itself, what the person is experiencing internally, or how a person feels, or it thinks about the world, or is conceptualizing something, that cannot be trusted in of itself. Instead, we need to have an external source that is measuring someone's thoughts and feelings, and often behaviors. And so I think there's a link between empiricism and behaviorism that really needs to be talked about, that kind of with the societal valuation and legitimization of empiricism and empiricism only, kind of things that can be quantified and measured. Along with that comes this push toward behaviorism. So this idea that our thoughts, our thoughts, our feelings, those kinds of ways of knowing things, the relational ways of knowing things, dialogue, storytelling, which we'll talk more about, those don't matter as much as our behaviors, because our behaviors are the only things that can be objectively tracked and analyzed, surveilled, measured, and really talked about in these objective external terms as opposed to a person's internal experience. And so I think when it comes to suicide, that kind of, and mental health in general, but very much so in the world of suicidology, that kind of translates to, it doesn't necessarily matter how a person is feeling or why they're feeling suicidal, why they're desiring to die. It just matters, you know, how many suicidal thoughts have they had, and what are these discrete measurable factors that have led to them? How can they be quantified? And then in terms of measuring outcomes, it tends to be about, reducing the number of suicidal thoughts, or reducing a person's suicidal attempts or suicidal gestures, suicidal behavior. It's kind of about improving their functioning in a way that we can quantify and measure and show that they're well functioning. It's not about this person's internal experience. It's not about what's leading them to feel suicidal. Talking about social justice, kind of what is the experience like of being marginalized or feeling like things are so bad that you want to die. It's not about talking about that or exploring that. It's about the quantifiable and the measurable.
And I think there's a strong connection between that and like suicidology's really strong emphasis on assessment and risk prediction. Like there's so many other things that suicidology could care about, but those are the sort of easiest things to try and measure. Easiest, I'm going to put in quotes, because we still haven't figured out how to effectively predict risk or assess people for suicide, but we really obsessively study that. And it's because it seems like the thing that would be most measurable.
Yeah, and I was thinking it also kind of with that risk measurement, it's linked to this idea that our first and only priority is about keeping the person safe or keeping the person from doing any external behaviors that might be tracked as a risk or negative or dysfunctional. It's not about necessarily helping a person feel better. And I think you can really see that in a lot of therapies that are offered. It's not about how can you feel better? How can we make your life better? It's about how can you tolerate the pain of life in a way where you're not posing a risk or posing a threat or engaging in any behaviors that make us uncomfortable, basically.
Right. And I think then from a public health perspective, people are defining suicide prevention success around, did less people die, instead of around like, do people want to live, or other things that might be different, like measures or more valuable to people.
I would even argue that the way that suicidology and its emphasis on risk, it's ultimately like missing people that are actually coming to the table wanting help by putting this emphasis on just trying to catch people that are suicidal or may experience a feeling of wanting to die. Whereas, like, what about all the people that are like in your face saying, hey, I'm here, I need help, I'm suffering? It's like more about like trying to cast this wide net to capture as many folks as possible and then control their behaviors.
Yeah, I think the ultimate message of it, and I think there's a lot of tension in mental health advocacy over like there's psychiatric abuse where there's involuntary commitment, and then there's psychiatric neglect where people are not getting help when they're asking for help. And I think ultimately the message of both is that emotional pain doesn't matter, that people's internal experience doesn't matter. If you're actually, going to kill yourself, or we think you pose a risk, then we need to involuntarily commit you so that you're safe. We don't necessarily, need to make your life better, treat you, give you any help, but we just need to keep your body physically safe so that you don't hurt yourself. But if you're in emotional pain, but you're a repeat attempter, or you're only quote unquote gesturing, you're not actually going to do it, then we're like, oh, that doesn't matter. And we don't care. So we're not going to commit you. We're not going to offer you help because you don't pose any physical risk. So the bottom line, I feel like, is just your emotional internal experience doesn't matter. That which we can quantify, which is, are you alive or dead, is the only thing that matters.
And I think like a great just recent example of how we can see this showing up too is like, so DBT is one of the most common interventions that people get when they're going to a hospital after suicide attempts, and especially if they're women and white. And I think there was just a study that came out that DBT doesn't actually make people less suicidal. It just makes them less likely to kill themselves. So like, we have clearly invested in that, right? We want to change your behavior, but you still have to live in this really horrible place because the ultimate goal is preventing death because we can measure that number. All right. TK, you want to take over?
Yes. Okay. So, I am a person with borderline personality disorder, and I am also a suicide attempt survivor. I experience chronic suicidal intensity, and so this to me is important personally and on like a political level as well. I think storytelling plays an important role in a handful of different ways. First, because storytelling has traditionally played a huge role in shaping the attitudes and beliefs of communities and cultures throughout history. So stories shape the kind of humans we become. Stories remind us of where we've been and also can influence the decisions we make going forward. In addition to the societal impact of storytelling, on an individual level, storytelling can provide an outlet for processing and making sense of the world around us and the trauma that we experience. Being able to disclose our own stories of horror, suffering, healing, and really all the things that happen on the spectrum of human experience can reinforce a sense of autonomy and authenticity in our experience. In my own opinion, I feel like I can glean more from hearing a person's story than I could from, reading 100 peer-reviewed articles. Part of my hang-up with research is that people with little to no lived experience with the subject that they're researching are in this position of interpreting our experiences. This reduces us to data points, which completely negates the nuance and individual in the experience. Earlier today, even, a comrade reminded me that only something like 3% of articles accepted by major suicidology journals, I won't name any, were qualitative or mixed method. And I question whether there's even a space for quantitative data in mental health research at all. Additionally, in the spaces where storytelling is welcomed, there is a ton of pressure, especially in the field of suicidology, for people with lived experience to tie everything up in this like neat, shiny bow of hope. Like, we're supposed to come out of this as like grateful for having suffered and survived that, when like that is not most people's experience, and it certainly isn't mine. It certainly isn't mine. Storytelling is, the most is most effective when a person has control of their narrative and isn't being forced to fit into a template of the good survivor.
Can you explain what you mean by good survivor?
Yeah, so I think that the space that's created for storytelling and the space that's created for lived experience, especially within research communities, that space is only relegated to people who fit into the template of somebody who is gracious, who is compliant. They go to therapy, they take their medications. It doesn't leave room for people who are angry at the system, angry with their families, angry with their communities, people who don't come out of it and are shaped as like this golden shiny child hope. Like for me, like I'm a person who still actively self-harms as a way of managing the pain that I experience. And the way I view it is like spaces where storytelling is allowed in the mainstream. Those spaces are specific to people who don't self-harm, take their pills as prescribed, go to therapy, and are grateful to be alive. Where like I'm angry, and many of my comrades are angry. We're angry with the systems that have set us up to fail. We're angry with our families and communities who have forced their idea of wellness on us. And you know, I know that for myself, like, I'm finding my way to wellness, and my way is unique. And sure, it is problematic in some ways, but I'm finding a way to survive. And why is that not valid? Why is that not valid?
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Emily, about storytelling?
Yeah, I would just say I think the link between kind of that imposed story of the good survivor and the empiricism, kind of the privileging of empiricism, it has to be made that there's kind of this reductionist narrative for both ways. That, yeah, on one hand, you have kind of this push toward telling a certain story with a certain narrative arc that's like very much laid out and yeah, kind of controlling of what your story should be. That first it was really bad and you were struggling, and then you had your suicide attempt, and then you got help and you got better, and things are so much better now. And that's being shown in your behavior, that you're not at risk anymore. It kind of comforts everyone who's hearing the story that, oh, this person was once at risk, committing risky behaviors that pose kind of a threat to the state or to functioning of society, and now they're not. Now they're no longer a risk. They're like an upstanding citizen. And I think in a lot of ways, like, empiricism is kind of the same thing. You kind of have like a certain format, a certain questions that you're asking that are kind of in that format of, like, you're defining what illness looks like and what were you like when you were unwell, what were your symptoms, and then you're kind of defining what wellness looks like. How long has it been since your last suicide attempt? How long has it been since you've engaged in this behavior? How many suicidal thoughts have you had? Like, these very quantifiable questions and very measurable metrics and goals that you're trying to get people to conform to and get people to move along in this arc. And just kind of, they're both very similar ideas of imposing what wellness means and what illness means, as opposed to asking people to explore that more and let people define it on their own. And so, yeah, so I think that it's important to kind of point out that storytelling can be that and kind of like go along with this empirical, like, quantifiable arc, or storytelling can be something radically different that's more about exploring our inner experience and coming to know things based on relational dialogue and exploration.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to spend some time talking about sort of the collection and dissemination of knowledge. And this is actually sort of what spurred this whole thing. Is I worked with a collective of people with lived experience to put out a survey that is not research by design. That is designed for people with lived experience with involuntary and voluntary hospitalizations for suicide attempts. And I didn't get IRB approval, and I will talk about why in a minute, because I think there's some really big issues with the IRB in general. And I put the survey out, and all of my friends in the research community, I am not sure, it was like a meltdown, a research community meltdown about me putting, and like lots of people were involved in this survey. People are consenting to participate in it. It's not research. I'm not funded by the government. I actually don't have to get an IRB legally because of the way that I'm doing this work. And I can direct you to where the information is about that if you're concerned still. But I for like days couldn't deal with the amount of messages I had on my phone from people telling me about why this method of knowledge production was wrong. I had people talk about how they wished I had done it in a legit way so that it could be published and then be behind a paywall where no one with lived experience can access it, or how this just makes it easier for researchers to ignore the work. And I'm like, so maybe you need to change. So there was a lot of activity that was generated around this survey. I specifically did this survey in the way I did because I knew that it would make it more likely for me to get more participants. And I got 250 participants in the survey in 24 hours. And so that tells you something about the way that knowledge is produced otherwise, that people are not finding that accessible. People do not feel motivated to participate because there is power involved in the way that research works. So let's talk about that. So objectivity in research is a myth, but we treat it like it's a reality all the time. They're like that everyone brings stuff into their position as a researcher. And there's an inherent power imbalance between the person performing research or the people performing research and the subjects of research. And unless you are doing something specifically to mitigate that power imbalance, it's going to run rampant and it's going to cause problems in the way that data is both like delivered to you and it gets interpreted. Our observations are influenced by our life experience, and most research is built upon this premise of like having some kind of like anonymity and not having a relationship with your participants in your research, which means that people won't trust you, so you're going to get different answers. So already there's flaws in objectivity in research. So we're relying on this unearned trust of like someone in a position of power, which, by the way, the mental health system has a long history of abuse of people. So there's definitely no trust that's been earned there. And there's this homogeneity of perspective that comes from that. So when you are controlling what kinds of knowledge get to be produced, you start to see all the same kinds of knowledge being produced, and those things sort of reify each other. They make each other more powerful. And then all of this is also restricted by funding. So like there are a few big funders out there that fund mental health research, and that's kind of it. And so if you're not aligning with their research agenda, you're unlikely to be able to fund your research, so you're going to have to find other ways. So then there's this part about who produces knowledge in this system. So the people who do produce knowledge in this system are cultural elite with hegemonic perspectives that create a false dichotomy between the people who produce knowledge and the people it's produced about. And these are people that are given the power to define reality for the people they study, because they're the ones who define the reality afterwards, not the participants. And then, so when we look at who knowledge is produced about, IRB and study guidelines limit who can participate. Like it's really common for you to get excluded if you've had suicidal thoughts in the last 3 months from suicide research. And people who have been harmed are unlikely to participate, because why would we sign up for more of that and sign up for something that might involve coercive interventions? And the people who are being researched are likely to look like the people who are performing research, because that research happens in specific locations with, you know, the cultural connections that people have, which is why the vast majority of mental health research has been on white, like middle-aged women and then college-aged men who are signing up for studies. And a lot of times it's college students who are signed up for studies because they get extra credit or whatever from their classes, right? So we're really missing out on good information about a broad range of people. And then that experience is being interpreted by the objective researcher who is not objective. So data is always filtered through the lens of the researcher and not the people being researched about. And there's always a power dynamic there. What are considered acceptable risks of an intervention or acceptable risks for someone to participate are determined by the researcher and not by the participant. And so you can see some things like EMDR and DBT, which might have really great outcomes for people theoretically, but both of which make things feel a whole lot worse for people before they feel better, if they feel better for people at all. So those are kind of like, those are just two examples. There's lots and lots and lots of other ones. And then the final kind of part of this is about how research is disseminated. So I think one of the biggest barriers to people having access to knowledge about suicide, particularly suicidal people having access to knowledge about suicide is because everything is behind a paywall. Like $35 minimum to read an article. And then it's an article that like may not even be relevant to you. You don't even know. So there's this general like accessibility issue around financial accessibility. But there's also like just who can access it, who even knows how to go about accessing this information or that it exists, where we publish, where the kind of language we use when we are publishing work. Like, is this written for people who are in the academy, or is this written for people who might be able to benefit from that knowledge in other ways? Is the research used to say we should do more research, or is the research used to say, and here are some recommendations for people in clinical settings or for people who are going through these kinds of concerns? And, you know, so the general thrust of research has really been around how do we predict risk and do assessment, and then how do we effectively intervene? But none of that's about like, what is the experience like for the person going through it? And wouldn't it be beneficial for someone who's struggling with suicide to know what it might be like for them to go through that experience, to be able to connect with other people who have? But that's not been the focus, because that doesn't get us toward those sort of number goals that we talked about earlier. So because of all of that, I wanted to find a way of producing knowledge that existed outside of this system. And the way I did it is by making a survey on Google and sending it out. And it was really disruptive in this in suicidology specifically for people. And I think that's something that we need to challenge ourselves about, is like, why are we having this strong a reaction to like suicide attempt survivors talking with other suicide attempt survivors about their experiences and then sharing that information with people? Like, why are the people who live through something not allowed to be the producers of knowledge, but researchers can? Like, what has happened that that's where we are? So the IRB has approved all kinds of heinous shit for people, like awful experimentation on people like us. So why would I put any stock in an institution that says like, yeah, it's okay, go on and hospitalize people? That seems like a valid intervention. In fact, I won't approve your study unless you're going to have a plan for how you hospitalize people that are too sick while you're evaluating them, even though we know that hospitalization isn't effective. We know that. We have research that says that. You all produced that research that says that, and you're still using it in an intervention that's mandatory as a part of your IRB process. So like, that institution is not really worth any of my time when it's not there to protect me. Now it's just there to protect funding interests. Like, I know about the history of the IRB and where that all came from, but when that tool becomes a tool of oppression, what's the purpose? So sorry, I went off kind of on a tangent about the IRB.
Yes, go on.
Do you two have anything to add to like collecting and disseminating knowledge?
I would just like to make the connection between the kind of knowledge that you were just talking about that is acceptable, and how people with lived experience talking about their experience of suicide is like not acceptable in research, and that shows up in treatment settings as well. Because as a person who has gone to treatment after a suicide attempt, I know firsthand that I'm not allowed to talk about my suicide attempt with my comrades in treatment. It is not even acceptable in a treatment setting, and I think that is problematic as hell. Excuse me while I open my blinds. It's dark in here.
Emily, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I really wanted to come back to when you were talking about the language that's used and what's accessible language and what's not. So I think officially now I'm a PhD dropout. Yay. And one of the major reasons that I did drop out was because of a lot of this, but also because, I found I'm a blogger and I love writing. But I found the writing that is done for research and academia to be almost impossible just the jargon that's used, the amount of like citation dumping is a common thing that you don't even really read and digest and explore material. Again, it's all about the metrics. It's about citing as much as possible and maybe not even reading the work. It's all about kind of increasing someone's impact factor or citation score, whatever they call it. And I think that kind of jargony, like heavy academic language really bars out people who like might not have access to as much education or might not speak that kind of language. And I think that ties in really heavily with this idea that suicidal people or people with lived experience of suicidality are thinking irrationally, or they're not of sound minds, they're not reasonable. There's this idea that because we have lived experience, that basically means that we're like cognitively impaired, or that we can't make our own decisions. And I think that kind of goes together with this idea that like, academic language and academic hierarchy is there to kind of idealize and reward this ideal of able-mindedness and being able to memorize and cite a bunch of material, read really quickly, store large amounts of information. It's not about, again, like relational knowledge or people who have different sources of knowledge that might not be classified in this ideal of like able-mindedness.
Yeah. So I want to do, I'm just looking at the Twitter feed and stuff really quick to see if we can respond to some things. So Ren said that the discussion is setting up a tension between empiricism or measurement and internal conceptual knowledge, and that she would argue that some of the best measures are ones that accurately reflect an internal concept, and a lot of work is put into this, and they don't have to be in opposing corners. Do you all have any response to that?
I think that can be true, and I think there is a lot of good work that's measuring internal concepts. I still feel like when things get quantified, there's always kind of this risk, this danger of reducing someone's experience. And yeah, I was thinking, like, I think the surrogate endpoint literature has a lot of really good information on this, that kind of, as soon as you quantify something, that's when you start measuring or start only caring about what's being quantified, as opposed to and starting to like all of your treatment outcomes and interventions are centered around whatever that very specific thing is, rather than what it's supposed to represent. So if you're measuring the amount of like suicidal thoughts or whatever, then it becomes, DBT, where you're supposed to hold ice cubes instead of having suicidal thoughts, rather than being about, what that might represent, whether it's, sadness or hopelessness or whatever.
Yeah.
I would also say that, like, we have all kinds of quantifiable data since the field of suicidology has, since its inception, and the suicide rates are only going up. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's this like sort of drive in suicidology that I see in showing up differently in other settings, where oftentimes research, particularly like the more empirical the research is presented as being, then the more or the less subject it is to critique. And I think that that's a big drawback in our field, is that we spend a lot of time proving the same things over and over and over again, and then saying that there's like not other ways of, and investing a lot of time in like not producing other ways of knowing things or other ways of understanding things. So like just the amount of attention and energy that is given to like the interpersonal theory of suicide. I don't mean to say that might not be a useful way of thinking about things, but like there are lots of other ways of thinking about suicide, and there's tons of gatekeeping happening to keep people from thinking about it differently. And that happens in, you know, academic journals, and it happens in like our discussions about research, and it happens in our funding structures, that like the way that we get to think about this issue is shaped by all of these institutions. And it's been shaped really unsuccessfully at meeting whatever, like if the defined goal of suicide prevention is preventing death, we're like utter failures at this. So why are we investing in doing sort of the same things over and over and over again instead of making space for new ways of knowing?
And I would also challenge the goal of death being the thing worth avoiding. Like, why is death the thing worth avoiding? How come we are not working further upstream to directly address the societal situations that create I'm sorry, let me back up. Why are we not addressing the issues in society which create a life that is not worth living? Why are we not addressing that? Why is the goal to prevent death? That is a low ass bar, and suicidologists ought to be ashamed of themselves. That is a low ass bar.
And maybe not like that attainable, right? So like giving people pathways to live lives that they choose seems like a lot more like functional to me than something like preventing death, which has sort of become the focus.
Right.
Yeah, I also think there's this inherent value judgment with this goal of preventing death, that death is worse than pain, or death is worse than living kind of a life where you're oppressed and marginalized. And it again comes back to this empirical measurement that like death is something you can quantify and you can show its economic impact, and you're losing a laborer and you're losing a consumer, and that's really terrible for capitalism, versus emotional pain, which you can't really quantify. So that's not going to be the goal.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Looking through the Twitter feed again.
I see you, Ren. I see you.
Yeah. So let's see. We have the pressure on having a golden narrative of suicide and self-harm experiences, and our narrow parameters on what is acceptable really stifles our ability to build models that reflect the full spectrum of suicide experiences and silences researchers with lived experience. I think that's one space. Researchers with lived experience, I think it's just a space that feels like extra influenced by these systems of power. Is like, so not only are you sort of like involved in this system that has maybe harmed you in the past, and like probably doing that in a way where you're hoping to make it a better, different system, but you're also like being told that like your experience makes you like not a credible witness, that your experience makes you like
biased.
Yeah, like maybe like more fallible as a researcher, like that you're less objective by having lived experience versus not, and things like that. So I think that space is really interesting and a really difficult one, and I think we get pushed out of it just because it feels so shitty to be in that position so much. So I really appreciate the researchers with lived experience that are like holding it down for us, because
practitioners with lived experience are not showing up in data sets, and that's fine. That's totally fine. But I shout out to all the psychiatrists and therapists that are out there that are going against the grain and talking with their clients about their own lived experience, because that is the kind of shit that I believe saves lives and is not quantifiable.
Yeah. Let's see. Is there anything that you all see on the Twitter feed that we should respond to? there's a lot going down. So I'm trying to keep up.
Jess, it's Anne Marie. Yeah, there is a lot going down, and it's been hard to put it into the feed. I just wanted to say that Rin had a couple Corbin's out there tweeting, and there are a couple of other people that I'm not familiar with. It was going through so fast. I turned my head and I had 35 more messages come in, and I went, yeah, okay, I can't get to all of those. But Rin had another couple of comments, and I'm trying to decide. All right, the first one said, going to be controversial here, though. I think there is space for jargony, heavy academic language. When we're trying to get really specific about the constructs we're trying to explore with other academics, it's hard to get on the same page without it. And then she followed, that being said, we absolutely need to be mindful about who we are leaving out of the conversations when this happens. We need to come up with more ways to have this conversation and disseminate knowledge at multiple levels instead of just sticking with the ivory tower language. I don't know if you saw her tweet, if I pasted it in there, but she was talking about burning down the ivory tower. And I said, I'm all for blowing up silos. So let's get together, you know? Yeah. Because Heidi and TK, from my perspective, what you probably don't know about me is I'm one of those feet on the street persons. And when I came on board 12 years ago to suicide, I've been 35 years in public health, but 12 years ago came on with suicide. It was a different ballgame, and I ended up coming in here because I was I'm the impacted family of someone who is a suicide attempt survivor. And Tracy Medeiros had her last attempt 21 years ago. She so fits into the not good survivor as far as sharing her story, and has often felt restricted sometimes in what she can or should say versus how she feels. She has finally, in the last couple of years, so I need to tell you, been very open about making sure, especially when we're talking with kids in schools and in different settings, being very open about the fact that she has suicidal thoughts, you know, and she has those dark times, and talks to the kids about, so what do you do with that? You know, and about the skill sets that she's learned. And that's not a conversation that's popular. And I know that, you know, it's sometimes not cool to sit there and say, what do you mean you're still having suicidal thoughts? Because one of the things that she and I have always talked about is no one ever said to her from the age of 16 up, and she's now in her early 50s, oh, by the way, this doesn't go away. You know, you're going to continue to take some medication, and they do that to parents still. The parents who come to me and say, Anne Marie, I don't get it. You know, he's on the medication doing this and he's still having suicidal thoughts. I said, didn't the therapist tell you that was going to happen? We don't have any literature that says, oh, this goes away and you'll live happily ever after and you never think that way again. And I don't think we're open and honest about it. I've been having a ball back here because I'm glad I was off volume, because I mean, you've got the best cheerleader in the world going on in here. Because I need to say this, because now I get it, Jess. Now I know what you're talking about. Okay. And now I understand. Now I understand what you're talking about. And because I needed that tangible. I needed that what can I put, how do I put my fingers on this? And it's like, I don't know, look down the hall in the house and look at Tracy. That's how you put your fingers on this. because she struggles with that. She doesn't think she's articulate enough. She doesn't think she has the right wording to phrase things enough. You know, she doesn't have that high level polished sound to it. And she occasionally needs notes, and she feels less than speaking as an attempt survivor who has an incredible story of resilience that is flawed, and it's supposed to be flawed. We're imperfect people. So no, you guys have a new fan. All right, I'm going to shut. But yeah, I have to tell you, the feed is moving faster than I can keep up with it.
All right, I found some things that I think we should address. So let's see. I want to talk about sort of mixed, I think some stuff around mixed methods came up in research, which I think is really powerful. You know, quantitative data tells us some information about like what maybe is happening at a specific point in time that we're measuring. And like maybe it tells us that. Sometimes I'm not even sure because it's hard. There are a lot of things that are hard to quantify. And qualitative data gives us more sort of perspective around why. I think combining those methods is really useful. I also think it's really useful to like look at other disciplines and not just do like positivist psychology research in this space. Like there's all kinds of other ways of doing research, even within the academy, that we're kind of not employing in suicidology. So becoming more interdisciplinary in our approaches would be really helpful. Do you all have anything you want to add about that?
I agree.
Okay. And then the other, I wanted to address Rin's comment about that there's a space for jargony, heavy academic language, and that it's helpful for people. So I think there can be a space for that. I just think it should never be at the expense of knowledge being accessible for other people, right? So like we ought to be thinking about knowledge when we're going to publish knowledge, we're going to put it, disseminate it in the world. Who might be the people that could need this and how do I make it accessible for them? Instead of just sort of that drive to publication, which is set up by the institutions that y'all have to work in if you're researchers. You might have different thoughts than me, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there can be a space. I just think it's interesting how like the jargon is more valuable, or that it's not just always about, I mean, I feel like it's usually not about, oh, I'm trying to find the words to explain this construct. I feel like it's usually about signaling that you are objective or you have more expertise, and using that kind of jargon or dropping those citations for all those articles that you just read the abstract of, that's considered expertise versus someone who has lived experience that might be using pretty simple language or might, just not have been to college, not have been in higher education settings. Like that's not signaling expertise. That's used as like, oh, that's a good like token story to go along with this. And so I think it's just really important to look at kind of the power that these different types of language are signaling. And if it were just, there's a space for both and they both signal different kinds of expertise, both, paid the same amount of accessible, or kind of considered given the same amount of like legitimacy and recognition, that would be one thing, but that's not what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, so let's do final thoughts. TK, do you want to go first?
Yes, sure. Okay, final thoughts. Well, and like just to back up and piggyback off Emily, different kinds of language for different kinds of audiences is one thing, but using jargon that creates a hierarchy, and hierarchies are meant to disclude certain audiences and to privilege certain audiences over others. So I hear you, Rin. I think I people earn that access to jargon, and I'm not trying to undo that. And I think jargon is used to separate the haves from the have-nots, and that's problematic to me, especially when the have-nots are the ones that are being researched. And so that's where I stand on that. I think overall, the crowds that I roll in and the comrades that I work with, and the activism that I do privileges people's lived experience above all. And the lowest common denominator deserve a space and a right to be able to share their experiences. And to me, that's where the most beautiful and accessible knowledge comes from. And if you want to know someone's experience with suicide, you ask a suicidal person, and then you take that into consideration, and you take into consideration all of their experience, all of their backpack of experiences that they come with, and that there is nothing more authentic than that. And on that note, I'll let y'all finish. I'm here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Emily?
Yeah, thank you both so much. I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm just really, really excited that these conversations are taking place. I just hope more of these conversations happen where, yeah, experience is really considered expertise, not, yeah, like empiricism. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the work that all of you are doing.
I think my final thought is going to be just getting back to this language piece. So I've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of these issues, and I think part of the reason people listen to me is because I'm really good at using academic language to talk about these concepts that that other people in my community as suicide attempt survivors or like mad people don't always have access to. And so I know that gives, like, I play the game enough to have enough of a voice to try and represent people. But it really sucks that that's the way in. So on that bummer of a thought.
Okay. Well, listen, I really want to I want to thank you all for coming on tonight. I certainly love seeing the Twitter feed fire up this way. Giving you certainly you will have all given me a really a lot to think about, and I have to say again, the phrasing and the language. Now I could have this conversation with the three of you. My perspective would have come differently, I think, if I had tried to introduce this subject, but I've been feeling some of the same things you've expressed in different ways. And I would imagine, I can't speak for the millions of impacted family members, but I would imagine there are a whole lot of people who feel the same way I do, especially if their loved ones didn't get the help they needed or didn't get the support. And we know that we know there's a lot of good work being done out there. And I don't want to diminish the hard work and the passion and the empathy of so many people out there. But we have to find better ways. We have to do better. It's that simple, because everything we're doing with each of us in our own ways, as passionate as we are, we're still losing too many people. And we need to find out what are those barriers. And it may not be comfortable. I'm generations away from all three of you, and I have had to adjust to having a value system and having a perspective that would have been totally different. And coming into the field as a professional, drummed into my head, about safe messaging, and I'm not negating that at all, but it's like when I came in to start doing suicide prevention work a dozen years ago. So some of the things that are in the very trainings that I deliver, we now know from research that was just released within the last year, don't hold water anymore. And it's, but I understand that, because I think that's the very nature of public health work, is that if we continue to do the research, however we do it, and you can change the way we do it, I don't have a problem with that. But when we finally get real data and real facts, it makes everybody step back and go, oh, what we were doing is maybe not the best, because now we've learned how to do new things. And I always equate it to, I lost my dad when I was 20 years old, and he had an extremely enlarged heart. He had 8 heart attacks in the course of 10 years, his first at 40. And what the surgeon said to him said to the family at that time, to us, when he died, was that we don't have the process to do what he needed. He needed a heart transplant. And actually, one had just happened. The very first had just happened. So I hope that we are on the threshold of having your voices come to the table. You're certainly welcome at our tables. And to sit and stir the pot, disturb the comfortable enough that you can help us find the ways that we can save more lives. And those are my final thoughts for the night. I can't thank you enough for being here. We will get this YouTube video out as quickly as possible, so that those who are watching GOT will get an opportunity to see it. It will be around. TK, Emily, Jess, thank you very much. Take care.
Solidarity.